I turned down a $6,000 raise last spring, and if you'd told me a year earlier I'd actually do that, I wouldn't have believed you. Not a demotion, not a trick, a real promotion, a real raise, sitting right there on my manager's desk with my name already typed into the offer letter, waiting for a signature that would have taken me about 4 seconds to get a year earlier. I said no. My manager actually asked me twice because people don't usually say no to $6,000, and for a second I watched him try to figure out if I'd misunderstood the offer. I hadn't. I understood it completely, which was exactly the problem. 6 months earlier, I would have said yes before he finished the sentence. No hesitation, no second thought. I'm not going to tell you why I said no yet, because the reason is almost nothing to do with the number on that offer letter, and everything to do with a different number that had quietly changed underneath me without me fully noticing until that exact moment in his office. That different number is the actual subject of this video, and by the end, you'll understand exactly why turning down $6,000 was one of the easiest decisions I've made in years. Here's what most people assume about a milestone like $20,000. That it's just a bigger, less interesting version of $1,000 or $5,000 or whatever number came before it. More of the same thing, just further along. That assumption misses something specific that actually happens right around this range. Something that has nothing to do with the size of the number and everything to do with what it structurally allows you to do that smaller numbers can't. Hello everyone, I'm Liam. This channel is about breaking down exactly what your money is actually doing to you, using real numbers instead of vague advice. And if that's useful to you, subscribing means you'll catch the next one of these too. Quick disclaimer, I'm not a financial advisor. This isn't personalized financial advice, and my own numbers and timeline reflect my specific situation, not a promise about anyone else's. So here's the actual claim. $20,000 isn't just a bigger emergency fund. It's roughly the point where your finances stop needing outside support to stay upright, and that shift changes decisions that have nothing to do with money on the surface, like apparently whether you take a $6,000 raise. And what outside support actually means here is exactly where this stops sounding abstract. Picture a building under construction, wrapped in scaffolding. The scaffolding isn't decoration. It's load-bearing in a real sense, holding the structure steady while the concrete cures, while the frame settles, while the building genuinely cannot yet hold its own weight. Nobody looks at scaffolding and thinks it's permanent. Everyone understands it comes down eventually. But here's the part people forget while they're standing inside a half-finished building. Taking the scaffolding down too early doesn't just look messy. It risks the whole structure because the building actually needed that external support during the specific window when it couldn't yet support itself. Most people's financial lives run on scaffolding for years, and they don't think of it that way because the scaffolding doesn't look like metal poles. It looks like staying at a job you'd otherwise leave, saying yes to overtime you don't actually want, living somewhere convenient instead of somewhere you'd choose, all because the structure underneath genuinely can't hold its own weight yet without that support. $20,000 is roughly where, for a lot of people, the building finally can. That's what was different in my manager's office. A year earlier, that $6,000 raise wasn't really optional. It was scaffolding I needed, propping up decisions I was making out of necessity rather than choice. By the time he offered it again, the building had quietly finished curing underneath me. What actually poured that concrete is a much smaller, much less dramatic story than you'd expect. Let's ground this in real numbers, because $20,000 sits in a genuinely rare zone most people never see. According to a 2026 survey from LendingTree, conducted with Question Pro, only 25% of Americans report having at least 5-figure savings, meaning a full 3/4 of the country hasn't crossed into the range $20,000 even sits at the lower edge of. That's not a niche statistic about low earners specifically. That's the whole country, every income bracket included. Here's why that rarity matters more than the dollar figure alone. Reaching this range almost always requires surviving the exact stretch where scaffolding is most tempting to lean on permanently. The stretch where a slightly worse job that pays a little more looks smarter than holding out, where debt looks like the reasonable shortcut instead of the expensive one. Getting through that stretch without leaning on it changes something structural about how you make decisions afterward. Not because you got lucky, but because you proved to yourself under real pressure that the building could actually stand without the poles holding it up. That proof doesn't disappear once you're through it. It becomes the thing you're actually drawing on, quietly, every time a decision shows up that used to be made entirely out of necessity. And once you see exactly how far behind most people the average five-figure saver actually started, the rarity of this number gets even stranger. Here's the math. I actually used to get there, because the path matters as much as the number itself. I set aside $300 a month, invested at a historical average return around 7%. At that rate, $20,000 arrives in just under 5 years, closer to 4 years and 9 months, to be specific. Push it to 5 full years, and you land closer to $21,480, with roughly $3,480 of that coming from growth alone, money I never technically earned through work at all. Total contributed over those 5 years, $18,000. Final value, $21,480. That gap, $3,480 sitting there doing nothing but compounding quietly in the background, is small enough to feel almost irrelevant on any single month and large enough, stacked across 5 years, to be the exact difference between scaffolding you still need and scaffolding you don't. None of that required a dramatic income jump. It required $300 a month, left alone, for roughly 5 years, through raises that could have gone toward a nicer apartment instead, through slow months where quitting would have felt completely reasonable. I wasn't tracking a milestone the whole time. I was just not stopping, the same unglamorous mechanism behind basically every version of this story I've ever told on this channel. But $21,480 isn't actually where this gets strange. What the data shows about everyone else my age is. According to a 2026 survey from Lending Tree and Deposit Accounts, the average highest savings balance Americans reported reaching in the past 12 months varies enormously by generation. Gens 9,672 dolara amerykańskiego. Millennials, ages 30 to 45, $17,002. Gen X, ages 46 to 61, $21,076. Baby boomers, $52,605. Sit with that Gen X number for a second, because it's not their current balance. It's their peak, the highest point they've ever reached, often after decades in the workforce. $21,076. That's within a few $100s of what I hit in under 5 years, starting from $300 a month. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying it because it reveals something uncomfortable about how slowly this milestone typically gets reached when there's no deliberate system behind it. Decades of scattered, inconsistent saving landing in roughly the same place 5 focused years can land you. The scaffolding metaphor holds here too. A lot of people spend decades adding a little support, removing it under pressure, adding it back, never quite getting a stretch long enough for the structure underneath to actually finish curing. It's not that they didn't try. It's that trying inconsistently, even for a long time, doesn't do what a shorter, uninterrupted stretch does. And what that uninterrupted stretch actually buys you, day to day, is where this stops being about the number entirely. Here's what actually changes once the scaffolding comes down, and it's smaller and stranger than people expect. It's not that money problems disappear. They don't. It's that certain decisions stop being financial decisions at all and go back to being regular ones. Whether to leave a job that's grinding you down stops being, can I survive the gap, and starts being, do I actually want to? Whether to say no to something unreasonable at work stops requiring a cost-benefit calculation about rent. It changes how a bad month lands, because a bad month stops threatening the whole structure and starts just being a bad month. It changes negotiations the way it does at every level of this. Desperation reads clearly to the person across the table, and so does its absence. And it changes something quieter that I didn't expect. I started making decisions based on what I actually wanted more often than what I could technically survive, which turns out to be a genuinely different way of moving through a week. That's the actual mechanism behind turning down $6,000. It was never really about not needing money. It was about the raise no longer being scaffolding, which meant I got to evaluate it as an actual choice for the first time. More hours, more travel, less time doing the parts of my job I still liked, instead of a number I couldn't afford to say no to. None of this happens the same way for everyone, and pretending otherwise would undersell how different some starting points genuinely are. I want to be honest about something, because skipping it would make this dishonest. $300 a month for 5 years assumes room that not everyone has. If your income is already fully absorbed by rent, food, and the basics, $20,000 isn't a discipline problem waiting to be solved with a better spreadsheet. It's math running into wages and costs that no amount of willpower single-handedly fixes. That's not a personal failure, and it's not something a video like this one gets to lecture anyone out of. But here's the reframe worth taking regardless of where your own starting line sits. This was never really about $20,000 specifically, or $300 a month, or 5 years exactly. It's about however much scaffolding is currently propping up your decisions, and whether there's any way, even a small one, to start letting a little of it come down on purpose instead of being forced to lean on it indefinitely. Someone finding $50 a month of room is running the identical mechanism I ran, just on a longer timeline, toward the same kind of structural independence. Now, let's go back to that office, because there's a detail about that conversation I haven't mentioned yet. My manager asked if I was sure. I told him I was, and then, because he looked genuinely confused, I told him why. Not the whole speech about scaffolding and structural weight, just the honest version. I said the raise was good money, but the job that came with it wasn't actually the job I wanted, and for the first time in a long time, I could tell the difference between those two things clearly enough to act on it. He nodded slowly, said he respected it, and that was it. No dramatic ending. I went back to my desk and finished the same work I'd been doing that morning. That's the part one don't think people expect from a story like this. It wasn't a movie moment. Nobody clapped. I didn't quit anything or storm out or make a speech. I just said no to $6,000 in a slightly awkward office conversation and went back to my day, and the only thing actually different about that moment, underneath all of it, was a number that had quietly finished growing months before I ever needed to use it. You don't need to raise to feel like freedom. You need the scaffolding gone before the offer even shows up.